business end. Today's guest has been involved in rugby all of his life as a player, as a coach, and as a journalist. Brendan Fanning played with Clontarf before moving into coaching and then journalism, where he's been reporting on the game since the mid 1980s. From 1986, he was a rugby correspondent for the Sunday Independent for 28 years, giving him a front row seat on Irish rugby's transformation over nearly 3 decades. In 2007, he published From There to Here, the definitive account of Ireland's transition from amateur to professional rugby, which won critical acclaim. He also co-authored Willie Anderson's best-selling autobiography, Crossing the Line, and now with his latest book, Touching Distance, Brendan takes us inside Irish rugby's battles with expectation, leadership and culture. Few people have had a better vantage point on the evolution of the game and the lessons it holds for rugby and leadership. Brendan Fanning, it's fantastic to have you on the show with us.
Thanks, Liam. Thanks a lot.
Welcome, Brendan.
Justin, how's it going, man?
Good. So let's go back to roots here. So you've been involved in rugby all your life, a player, a coach, and now a journalist. How did those early days at Clontarf shape the way you see the game?
I was going to say not as much as you'd think, but the one thing I realised was the madness of what we were doing initially as a player and then as a coach. And I tried to put into the coaching what I'd learned from playing. But if I could take you back to the playing scene in the 70s and 80s, late 70s and 80s, when I was playing club rugby, when I was just coming out of school, there was this crazy situation where on a Tuesday night you would do what was called physical, which wasn't physical at all. It wasn't physically engaging. It was running and jumping and lying down and all this rubbish. And then on a Thursday night you would do ball work, which really wasn't ball work either. It involved a lot of unopposed running. And then on a Saturday, you would go out and you kick the ball all day. And the disconnects between the three, we were never fit enough. We never had the ball skills. And even when it came to Saturday, we didn't need the ball skills because we had no intention of using them. And this is what the amateur game was built on at the time. Big fellas who weren't fit, but who had an out half, who could kick the ball better than the others. No, I'm simplifying a little bit, but wasn't that bad. So when I moved into the coaching end of things, I thought, oh look, there has to be more to life than this. So I tried to learn as much as I could, for as many sources as I could, and I was never slow to abuse my position as a journalist, particularly on tours, to get in and watch other teams train. So if I was in New Zealand or Australia or South Africa or wherever, and initially this was the early 90s. So certainly when it came to the touring, it was the early 90s. And there were no media prevention officers. This was pre-professionalism. You could come and go as you please, and you could go and talk to people. You didn't have to make an appointment. You didn't have to do any of that stuff. And you could get as much info as you could and bring it away and then try and apply it. So that was an unbelievable entry point, if you like, to learning about rugby. And then professionalism came, and it was just, I knew this would come up in some way or form, and I'm thinking, okay, these fellas have a business head on them as well as a sports head. And I'm trying to think, how can I draw an accurate analogy? I'd say it was not unlike Brexit. Trading in a pre-Brexit era when you were part of the EU, and then suddenly all the rules get ripped up and chucked out the window and you're in a whole new environment. It wasn't wildly different to that.
Absolutely. But did it I suppose the connection could be the stories, Brendan, with what happened in the 70s and 80s and how that's lived through perhaps in your journalism?
Yeah, the stories were always critically important, and they were easier to get back then because, as I say, there weren't media prevention officers in the way, and it is still it's sport, so it's human interest, and the nuts and bolts of pro rugby are not that far removed from amateur rugby in terms of the importance of teamwork and spirit. But we are operating now in a whole different environment where some of the stuff that went on at amateur level, and we've all come across coaches who said and did things in the amateur era which would have them in the High Court now if that was to happen. But what has continued and I guess developed is, I won't say it's unique because I'm sure other sports have it to varying degrees, but it does seem to be special in rugby that teamwork is is extremely important. And you have a decent chance of getting back what you put in. And if you work really, really hard on building that empathy and that teamwork among your squad, then you have a half decent chance of getting it back at the other end.
It's interesting what you're saying there. I was thinking there's a little bit of an age gap, but not too big of an age gap between us. So I don't remember quite, as you were explaining, the physical on the Tuesday and the ball work on a Thursday. But coming into adult rugby when I did in the early 90s, there was still a lot of emphasis built around small picture cone work. So you'd work within a 10 by 10 grid or whatever. And, you don't know what you don't know. And I remember thinking later on reflection as the game had evolved and moved on in its coaching, what am I trying to learn here? And it bears no semblance of what we're being asked to do at the weekend. Where is the transference, which I think was your point? It doesn't connect at all. Yeah, bizarre, and it's great to see how that's evolved over time in the game.
The disconnect is, I think the disconnect is because we didn't ask enough questions. Back then, we just did what was handed down to us, and very few people stopped to say, "What are we at, lads? This makes sense." Whereas the environment now is completely different. And I see that from other coaches and listening to and watching what other coaches do and how much they engage people. And I remember Brian Ashton was one of the first guys I came across who was challenging players and asking them to figure stuff out for themselves, as opposed to, here are the tablets of stone, lads, now just read what's on them and follow the steps. And his history with Ireland was interesting in that, RFU got into bed with Brian Ashton without doing enough due diligence, and he certainly didn't do enough due diligence. He didn't know what he was getting involved with, and he didn't know how bad it was, and he tried to impose his way of doing things, not impose, but introduce that to Ireland, where our lads were just a mile off the pace, and they just really weren't prepared for what Brian Ashton was bringing. And he should have known that and learned it, not before it was too late. And there's so much of that now where coaches, perhaps it's the same in business, I don't know, coaches are really not so much putting pressure, but opening the door to players and challenging them and inviting them to say, give us your feedback here. How do you think we want to play this? How do you think this should work? And make it more of a collaborative rather than a dictator type process.
Agreed. So let's go into your journalistic career. You started reporting in the mid-80s. You became a rugby correspondent with Sunday Independent in 96. That's nearly 40 years of front row access. What stands out to you as the biggest change you've witnessed in the sport?
It's that professionalism and that responsibility where suddenly you had to own stuff and you couldn't just square it away and say, life is swings and roundabouts. Eventually it'll come around our way again. And I remember Noel Murphy, who was a very big hitter politically in Ireland at the time and was a rugby legend in his own right, both with Ireland and with the Lions. And we were on tour. I was reporting on Ireland's tour in New Zealand in 1992, which was just carnage from pillar to post. And Noisy, as he was known, his response was, "Look, life is full of surprises." And I'm thinking, Jesus, it's not. You have to try and shape what's going to happen and minimize the surprises. And there was a grain of truth to what he said. There was also more than a couple of grains of truth to Roy Keane from a different sport saying, if you fail to prepare, you better prepare to fail. And that the difference of professionalism was, you're now earning a wedge for doing this. This is your job. And you need to front up, do your prep, and then come along on a Saturday or Sunday or whatever the game day is and deliver what you've learned. And if you haven't prepped during the week, you can't possibly hope to succeed at the weekend. Throughout the amateur era, that wasn't an issue. Once the pro era came along, and it took quite a while for that to bed in, the concept of responsibility. Once that set in, then it was just a whole different game. And I found that really interesting to follow, particularly, and you guys would get that, particularly because of your knowledge of the Irish system. You would have known that, you know what, if we start taking this seriously, we could be really good at it. Imagine our growth potential. We had a really high ceiling, and that explains partly where Ireland are now, is that after a few years of mucking around, and the IRFU had the handbrake on because they didn't really like professionalism. They didn't really want to go forward with it. Eventually they had to. And once they began to take it seriously, hey, presto, turns out we're not too shabby at this. Which brings us to the current situation where we're one of the world leaders, which is, given the base that we're playing off, is remarkable.
Well, and you made a really interesting point there. Well, many interesting points, but when coming through or starting to sort of look towards being involved in the Irish system, it felt to me, it was okay to have, looking in from the outside, a good 50 minutes, and then fall away in the last quarter of the game. And, we were valiant losers, to use, not always, but a lot of the time. And then in that late 90s period, early 2000s, amongst many different changes, you had the like of Dr. Liam Hennessy coming involved and really setting the players and the teams and the coaches up for success by preparing physically, building the athlete, building the engine so that we could be 80-minute players or 90-minute players, and staying in that arm wrestle and giving us a possibility of winning late in the game as opposed to getting it done in the first 50 minutes, if that makes sense. So, and there were many other changes there, but that for me, that sort of crossover period between amateur and professional felt to be a very, very important one, and built a lot of confidence, I think, in what was possible provincially and internationally.
Fitzy, that used to drive me absolutely batshit crazy. I would be off reporting on Ireland knowing, on a Southern Hemisphere tour.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example. Australia 1994. So we were moderately competitive along at various points. But basically, it was a follow-on from New Zealand in 92. We were getting battered because physically we weren't at the same ballpark as the Aussies. Mm-hmm. And I remember we were on the way home, and I fell in step with Simon Gagan as we were boarding. We stopped in Bangkok or wherever on the way home. And we're getting on the flight. We're just chatting, getting on the plane. And I said, do you ever think you'll be coming back here, or maybe New Zealand or wherever, with an Irish team that is actually physically fit enough to cope with a tour like this? And he looked at me and he laughed. And he said, not in my lifetime, mate. Mm-hmm. And we went our separate ways. And I thought, Christ, how sad is that? He was at the peak of his powers. And it was just the notion that you don't need any skill to get fit. You just need you need diligence, and you need preparation, and you need direction. And you mentioned,
and you need a system. You need a system in place, and in fairness, having gone through that process at the time with Hennessy and others, it was just setting standards, putting a process in place and setting expectations of what was expected of players as professionals. And, that's, and that layering of those standards, not exclusively, but certainly built a platform, in my opinion, to where the provinces and the national team are now.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's shameful, I think, it's not too strong a word, how long it took us to cop onto that. And I think at the root of that was that the IRFU, because getting fit took time and it required application and it required diligence, I think they had a bit of a distaste for it because it was quasi-professional. And we're talking about getting fit before the game went pro, like in the early 90s when the others were doing it and we weren't.
Yeah.
And they thought there was a bit of a whiff of professionalism about this. We don't do that. And I thought that was fundamentally dishonest. But the irony was, you mentioned Liam Hennessy, and Liam was a game changer for us. And in fairness to Noel Murphy, whom I criticised earlier for his swings and roundabouts lean to, he was instrumental in bringing Liam in eventually and saying, look, we need to get a grip of this, lads. And Liam had a brilliant CV from professional football and other stuff. When we went to the World Cup in 2007, so that's 12 years after the game had gone open, we end up having a horrible experience in the World Cup in France because we didn't have enough game time ahead of the tournament because it all went arseways. and Liam Hennessy was the fitness boss and Eddie O'Sullivan was the coach. And they were colleagues from Physical Education College in Limerick years previously, and good friends. And they had a major falling out over the way the team was prepped, a major falling out. And to this day, there might be a little bit of contact, but not that much. And the irony was that both of them had done so much to fix Ireland's fundamental problem of fitness. It should come around. The last thing in the world we expected was we're going to get undone by fitness. But we did, simply because a cock-up happened in the scheduling of matches pre-tournament, so Ireland were undercooked when they went. And it was when I was writing the book, in fairness to both Liam and Eddie, they were both very forthcoming on the record about how that relationship broke down and why it broke down. And it was sad, because these guys were good mates, and it was actually sad to record.
I did not know that, and that's another good reason why I'm going to be reading your book. That's incredibly interesting. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I can remember the early days. I joined London Irish in 1990, 91, and I actually, got to be honest, I didn't drink. I used to train, and the only way you could get on there, I felt, is I had to drink. And I used to do weights, as Fitzy knows. I was probably one of the only other player that did weights at London Irish was a chap called Brian Robinson, who played number 8. And I thought, wow, I'm too serious. I need to get involved in some drinking. Yeah, it's amazing how it's developed. But going on to journalism, in journalism you have to tell hard truths, and a lot of what you do as well is built on trust and personal relationships. I mean, how do you manage that relationship when you've got to tell hard truths in the press about people, at the same time you've got to win their trust as well? How do you balance that?
Well, I'll put it this way. The way a coach comes in, and for the first in pre-season everybody likes him, and then what happens? He picks a team, so suddenly those numbered 1 to 15 think he's a pretty good bloke. Those numbered 15 to 23 are a little bit unsure, and those numbered 23 to 35 or 40 or whatever how big the squad is, they're not that keen on him, so because they're just not getting a look in. From my side of the fence, I'm grand with Liam Mooney, and I'm grand with Justin Fitz, so long as I'm saying these, great effort and great performance and absolutely worth their place. But the moment I say Liam Mooney that was a bad selection, he should have been replaced at halftime or whatever, suddenly Liam Mooney goes, this guy's talking to his hat. What does he know? And that's 9 times out of 10, that's the way it goes. But to go back to Justin's point about fitness, in 1998, I was in the Sunday Indo, and we got hold of a fitness report. So Warren Gattle would have been the coach, and Craig White would have been the fitness manager. And we got hold of the results of a fitness report that were shocking from the Ireland squad. So initially we printed the nuts and bolts of the report without naming specific players. If you were in the mix, though, you would have known, you probably would have been able to identify who was who. And that didn't do much for my relationship with a good number of those people involved. It did no harm to my relationship with Warren Gatland, because he was glad that the story got out, and he put it into it needed oxygen so punters would realise just how bad it was. And Craig White, it was justifying for him, because he was jumping up and down going, Jesus, we can't accept this. So I put it into the public domain, and a lot of the players had their noses out of joint. Bar one guy, Gary Longwell, whom you'd both remember. And Gary Longwell playing for Ballymena and Ulster at the time. And his scores were shocking. I don't know what he was benching or whatever, but it was a mile removed from what was respectable. And the reason it was a mile removed from what was respectable was because his application was a mile removed from what it should be. So he was a bit embarrassed about this getting into the public domain. And Gary said to himself, okay, who's the problem here? Is it me, or is this journo here who's delighted to get his hands on the story? And he quickly made a logical decision that it wasn't the messenger, it was the message. And he turned himself around and subsequently went on to have an improved career. Whereas a handful of other people involved I said, no, that's not what journals are for. So there you go.
Absolutely. It's two. Me and Fitzy talk about this with business. Like, number one, having difficult conversations. As long as people know that you're coming from the right point and their boundaries there, they accept it. But the other key point you mentioned there about Gary Longwell, and fair play to the guy, is accepting feedback and responding it in the right way. He obviously took that on board and improved it and didn't see it in a negative way. And that's an important thing for any individual or elite performer, to take criticism or feedback on board.
Yeah, if I don't know enough about business to know how easily transferable that is, given the environment and the regulations and the do's and don'ts and HR hovering in the background and all of that. I still think it's probably easier in a sporting environment than it is in a business environment, of which you fellas would know more than me.
I think sport does it way better than business, and I think business can learn from sport about the way that that's dealt with. And that's what I think. It should, having difficult conversations and taking feedback and criticism is a lot of business executives are looking into that more, for sure. It's way behind sport when it comes to that. Yeah.
And I think also, I mean, what you've just said there is a snapshot of time in terms of what the mindset was of the group of players, and I was in and around that group of, is it enough to be in the system, or do we want to be in the system and be competitive, right? And so that was transformational at that period of time. I think Gats did a great job, and you mentioned Craig White. He was a fantastic fitness guru, and Liam Hennessy and those guys, and they took it from where it had been in the amateur and bridged that gap and set a strong foundation for the coaches that came on after them, setting that standards and increasing it and moving it on. And it's no different in business when a new CEO takes over or a new manager, that they're setting their standards and their aspirations, looking at where they are and looking where the improvements are. And as you mentioned earlier, with fitness, it doesn't take any skill. It just takes application and a bit of time. You put time into fitness, you get fit. And that was a game changer. It wasn't the only game changer. There was a lot of other things done, but that had been an Achilles heel of the Irish team for many years, as we talked about. 50 minutes and then the gasket blows and we're scrambling, and that changed. And now I think we're regarded as a nation with one of the best physically prepared squads in the world, which is a marked change over that 30.
Sure. A question then of that's we've established that's the bottom line. That just got us into the party. Thereafter, it's a question of how you're going to perform, and that's that was when the real challenge started. And as we mentioned earlier on, Ireland's growth room was so good that once we started getting the right people in, then it was almost inevitable that we were going to be pretty good at it.
100%. So let's go back to your book. From there to here, you document Ireland's leap from amateur to professional rugby. Why was it so important to capture that moment in time?
Because it was insane, and it was it was an absolute treasure trove of madness, the stuff that was going on. And I said, I can't just let this go. I have to scoop all this stuff up and because when we started making the improvements, and that book came out in 2007, by which stage we had left a lot of the stuff behind us. And I said, oh, Jesus, people need to appreciate just how crazy it was. Perhaps the craziest point was, and we mentioned him earlier, was Brian Ashton. And he was a wet week in the job when he was given control of a development tour to New Zealand and Samoa. And it was just carnage. It really was. I remember coming across him one day at a pre-tour camp down in Limerick. And he was in front of a big clunky television set, and he had lots of VHS tapes, and he was whacking them in. He was looking at footage of some of the teams that Ireland were going to play in New Zealand. And this had come just after a training session, an open training session, which we had attended, in which he was doing basic passing lines. And he was losing the will to live at the ineptitude of the Irish fellas to make basic 5-metre passes flat passes off left and right. And the bubble coming out of his head is going, Jesus, we're going down to New Zealand in a few weeks' time. We're going to get absolutely mullered, which is exactly what happened. And it got to a point on the tour where players, if they got injured, were just, thank God it's over. I can go. I can go home. And they were humiliated by the Kiwis. Kiwis have absolutely no time for you in rugby unless you're good at it. Valiant second bests, moral victories, that's not in their lexicon. There's win and lose. If you win, if you beat them, they'll respect you. If you don't beat them, they won't respect you. And they looked at Ireland early doors on that tour and said, Jesus, these guys are just a bunch of jokers. And at one point, I remember Gary Halpin, it was half time in a Super Rugby match, and the Irish guys were at the game, and they were going to do a halftime piece to camera for Sky in New Zealand. This is about 2 games into the tour. So Gary Halpin had gone around with somebody else, and by the time they had got around to do the piece to camera, the message had come down to say, no, it's okay. We'll take another ad, or we'll go to Maisie talking about the weather or whatever. Like there's no value in talking to these guys. Like it was shocking. It was shocking stuff, but brilliant to witness in its own way.
Fitzy was on that tour. Yeah, but you had a positive experience of that tour, Fitzy. If you want to.
I did, and your description of it is spot on. And again, I had no frame of reference going on. I was a late call up to that tour. Peter Close had got injured for the Lions. Paul Wallace had got called up, and I was pulled in to replace him. Never been involved in the Irish setup before, and had no frame of reference what was going on. And my experience over that 6 weeks was, it was, used word carnage. It was that, we'd have 2-hour plus sessions a day, very, very, very tough, often interspersed with some weights in between. It was incredibly, incredibly tough. And that's not to make an excuse for the performances. We were where we were at the time. I didn't understand, I was naive. I was 20, 21, 22 at the time. I had no idea. I was just, okay, I'll just turn up. I'll work as hard as I can, keep putting one foot in front of the other, try and recover as best I can and just get through it. And many years later at a coaching conference in Dublin, Brian had been invited in to speak, and I hadn't seen him in quite some time. And I asked him, I said, what was the thought process with that? He said, look, Fitz, we had a World Cup, I think 18 months later, something like that, not long afterwards. And I didn't know the players. I wasn't impressed with the standard, and I wanted to see who had the mental fortitude and will to get through a volume of work, because I knew it was going to be hard. I needed mentally tough people with me. And there was a lot of people that dropped off, and they were lost to the system because they didn't have what he was looking for. And there were others that came through, and I think and went on to have great careers, like some Mal Kelly and David Wallace, and to name but a few that have really stood up, really got through the work and performed, struggling with difficult circumstances.
Yeah, that was 97, and the World Cup he was talking about was 99, which brings us to getting beaten by the Argies in Lens.
Yes.
So if there was a humiliation around the development tour in 97, then getting beaten 3 times by Italy in the space of a couple of seasons really didn't help. And then they go to the World Cup in 99, they end up getting beaten by the Argies. And at that point, the IRFU said, oh, hang on a sec, we got to stop pulling up the handbrake. We have our 4 provinces. We've allowed them be contracted. We need to put our shoulder to the wheel here and see if we can make this thing. So that was a critical few years in the evolution of the game here.
Just going back as well on a lighter note, I think that they should have listened to Gary Halpin for that 10-minute interlude at half time, because it would have been more entertainment than the weather that was going on in New Zealand. So we all know Gary. But you've alluded to this, we've talked about culture as well, which we discussed over on email. But what were the biggest cultural shocks of the transition from amateur to rugby? And do you see any similar lessons for businesses that need to face rapid change or a slower change, in this case with Irish rugby?
Cultural, this sounds a bit trite, the cultural thing is still evolving, but I think it is, because for my money, lots of people bang on about culture and they've no real understanding of what it is. Stuff that happens is ascribed to either a good culture or a bad culture, and I'm not sure that that's right either. And when teams sit down now at the start of the season, which never would have happened back then, and said, let's talk about culture and how we're going to approach things, I think they need to be careful what they sign up to, and they need to be sure that everybody's on board with it. And they need to be sure that what they're signing up to is livable. So I'm interested to hear your definition or your understanding of what culture is and how it relates to business. Personally, I think a business has loads to learn in this from sport because rugby has improved. But I'm interested to hear what you guys have in your heads when it comes to culture.
So I think culture is the intangibles that you can't put your finger on. So it's having a team where the sum of the parts are greater than the team. So it's having people within the team that want to go that extra yard. It's having people in business that, I mean, I talk about this a lot. I can have 2 recruiters doing exactly the same thing, but someone always gets results. Why? Because of intent. They've got that mentality to go that extra bit further than anyone else would go, and is creating that kind of environment where that sort of atmosphere thrives. That for me is culture, and that comes from leadership, and it comes from the top, and it comes from a leader that will care about the individuals. Sometimes they'll be soft and sometimes they'll be tough, but that to me would be the culture, or how I would describe it in business. Just the hidden things that you don't really see, you don't really hear about, and it's very hard to put your finger on that.
Yeah, I would agree with that and sort of build on that. But I would also say and agree with you, Brendan. I think that business can learn a lot from sport in terms of creating that culture. For me, it's that invisible architecture that shapes any team or business. It's the daily habits, values, standards that group holds itself accountable to, and how people act under pressure. You know, when it comes on, it's great. So, you know, having a slogan on a wall, and as we laughed about the other day, I love a good wall slogan, but that's fine when everything's going well. You see whether that culture is embedded and lived when things aren't going as well. How the individual reacts, how the unit reacts, how the team reacts, how the broader team reacts to that pressure. That's when you know whether there's a strong, livable culture within the group.
Yeah.
Sorry, Liam, that's why I said at the start, you have to be careful what you're signing up to. Because when the pressure comes on and you need to behave, look, hang on, we've covered this. In chapter 2 of our manual on culture, this is how we react. And I'm simplifying there. But you have to future-proof your system so that you know when it gets really tough and when we're under the pump and we're sweating and we're struggling to breathe, let alone think. How are we going to do what we said we would do? So make sure that what you say you will do in the first place is practical and is livable and is something that you can deliver on. Because if it is, the comfort you're going to get from that is huge. And it's when I think of businesses, I think of, you know, you might be getting an email from HR saying, oh, here's a link to a yoga class or whatever, and there's paintballing on Saturday week. Like, that's just, you know, that's just, you know.
I'll say
thank you. That's what it is.
Sorry, Mo, go on.
Yeah, I was going to say on that point, I mean, Tony Underwood talked about this. It's not like, I mean, it's small gestures from leaders that create buy-in. It's not going on a paintball trip or anything like that. It's actually the leader that cares, that says, how are you today? Or, you know, and listens to their staff. And before Fitzy comes in, I was going to say, if businesses could just take 10% of what a rugby team would have, their businesses would be a lot more successful. And it's about finding the right people and the right kind of players within the team as well. You need people with a sense of humor when the chips are down. You know, you need leaders that care. You need the right blend there. But yeah, I mean, companies don't really understand culture. They think, you know, putting out a whiteboard and going on a few corporate team building days is culture. No, it's not. It's actually about caring and finding people that care and buy in and going for it. And that's what culture is to me as a business owner and as a ex-sportsman, I suppose.
Okay, there's a word you used there 5 times in the last 2 or 3 minutes.
Sorry, Brendan. Sorry.
No, that's
go
okay.
on.
Do you know what the word? You know what that word is?
No, go on.
Care.
Care. Yeah.
Yeah, and I have found in rugby in recent times that has now become front and center. Andy Farrell gets a lot of the credit for that in this jurisdiction, and I'm not sure how easily transferable that is to business, because Liam Mooney's the CEO and he is sweating buckets on a daily basis over the bottom line and blah, blah, blah. And he hires Brent Fanning or he hires Justin Fitzpatrick. All he wants these guys to do is hit their targets, and how they behave once they go home, what kind of people they are, I don't care. I just want them to do their job. And they don't understand that happy people are productive people. And I'm going to be happier if you don't have to be false in making out how are the family when you know nothing about my family. But there are ways in which you can manifest a caring environment, and the byproduct of which is a more productive environment if you think about it. But also the care element really, I think, in business also needs, I probably can learn from rugby, in that in the old days when I wouldn't even send you a text to tell you were dropped, you'd rock up to the club on the Thursday night or the Tuesday night, and the team sheet would be on the board, and El Mooney wouldn't be there. That was how you got the message. So when it comes to letting people go in business, man, I'm regularly gobsmacked at the insensitivity and crassness with which people are let go.
Yeah.
It's awful.
I mean, what I would say, about the level of care from, some business owners are good, some CEOs are good, and they're trained on it. But it is like, I could speak to any CEO and give them stats on why they should care, attrition rates, how many days sick has this person had? It's all evident, and it costs the business money. And that's the reason why they should care. But natural leaders care anyway. Yes. And they find themselves in that position and they will care. And I think the best leaders, as we've discussed many a time, are the leaders that have had hardship and have been through the mill a bit, and it makes them more caring as leaders. If your leader cares, that basically, and it's not like a fluffy word, it actually means being able to give someone a good old bollocking sometimes, and is taken in the right way because they think the leader has got their interests at heart and they're going to respond. And also that leader then will be able to have difficult conversations with people, and they should have difficult conversations when they say, Brendan, we might have to make redundancies here in 9 months, and you're pre-warned. That's what a caring leader would do, rather than being hoiked into a HR office and saying, off you go, there's your redundancy. Business is light years behind sport when it comes to that, and sport really is probably only caught up with professionalism in the last 15 years, as you're allude to, Brendan. But that to me, that's what it's about. But natural leaders, a natural leader will definitely care at some point. So
it's so hard to get it right, but the book deals with that, the different styles of coaching. Certainly Andy Farrell has managed to create an environment where players feel that degree of warmth, which is it sounds wrong in a brutally violent sport like rugby, but it is the case. I remember interviewing Ian Henderson out in Abbottstown at the High Performance Centre a couple of years ago, and he was playing for Ulster at the time. Dan McFarland was the Ulster coach, and he talked ad nauseum about how caring the environment was with Andy Farrell. And I was struck by the fact that he didn't mention the Dan McFarland situation once, which to me was pretty obvious that probably Dan's race had been run. And it's interesting because everything has a shelf life. And I deal with this in the book. When Dan McFarland came in, he stopped a revolving door in Ulster's coaching, and everybody welcomed him. He had done a very good job, and he elsewhere, and he did a good job, and he settled into Ulster. And he worked very hard on creating themes, and rugby players love themes. Possibly it's more prevalent nowadays than it would have been when you guys were stomping around Sunbury. And he put a lot of nuts and bolts in around the way the operation functioned. But when it started to go wrong, it really started to go wrong. And I don't think he had all the tools to cope with it when it was going wrong. And suddenly at the end, it sounded like he was blaming players when kind of, page one, it says, don't blame the players, say we rather than they, all of this kind of stuff. And Farrell is good at that. I have to say, he is, I wouldn't say he's cornered the market on it, but clearly he has done a very good job.
It's interesting, and what you're saying there, and I want to go back as well. I mean, putting culture in or setting culture in, whether it's business or in a team, is difficult. And you mentioned we and they, singular or collective. And I think for me, that's the most important thing. You've got a lot of very talented leaders out there in industry and in sport that the culture, but don't necessarily involve the group in the process. And that's important. When you're involved in the process of setting that culture, you're invested in it, and that's and that can't always be done every season, but in its entirety, if you've already got a set culture in your team or your business. But it comes to that onboarding. How do you involve people that are coming new into it? How do you integrate them into the system? That becomes very, very important. And I haven't had the privilege of being around Andy Farrell, but that what you're saying there comes through in spades. He brings people with them. He gives them ownership. He makes them feel involved, and that's the mark of a great culture. Yeah, absolutely.
And too many companies nowadays, Brendan, have designated departments where it's tick box exercise. You've got someone that deals with mental health, a mental health first aider, and they just tick the box. But there's not enough people taking responsibility. I don't know. It's a bit of inertia in business at the moment, but showing that empathy, showing that care, going around speaking to people. That department does this and this department does that. And I just think, it's just a whole feeling of inertia around companies. And I think leaders need to start challenging companies on that type of thing.
Is this a not a buzzword, but is this a thing? Is this a trend now in business whereby they realize, we need to get on board with this and spend more time and be more creative about how we do it, simply because it affects our bottom line? Or is it that, oh Christ, this has just come down, it's another regulation, we better implement it? I'm interested to know what the motivation is for, because in sport, everybody's locked into it now.
Well, I think you answered. Sorry, Mooney. I think you answered your own question a moment ago. You said, "Well, a happy employee, a happy player, is a more productive member." And it can, And here's the thing with sport, life, and business: it's full of ups and downs. So if you've got that strong foundation, if you feel part of the group, part of the whole, part of the mission, you're more likely to deal with those issues and problems in a more productive way than you are if you're just feel that you're turning up, knocking out your hours and getting out of there, and you have no connection to the coach, the boss, your co-workers, your teammates, etc., etc. So you're probably right, and I think you are 100% right, that maybe it's a bit of a buzz for some, and they're just trying to tick boxes. But those who really grasp it, whether it's coaches, organizations, businesses, that grasp the importance of culture and understand the process of implementing it, are setting themselves up for success. Not necessarily without problems or heartaches, because that's life. You can't always take everyone with you, but you're able to take the majority of the group with you and better deal with those issues.
Yeah. Sorry, the beauty of that is, those who you aren't able to take with you, you're able to sit them down surely early in the piece and say, you know what, this is not going to work out.
No.
Yeah.
You're not for us, we're not for you. Let's shake hands and part company.
Exactly right, Brendan.
And I would say, going back to what you said, Fitzy, sorry, before you ask the next question, two things about leaders. Some leaders just will do it because they just naturally care. And they'll just do it because they're not doing it for the bottom line. They just care about the group. The best leaders care about the bottom line as well as the people. So they care about the money and they care about the people. And if you get a CEO that comes in and they're trying to build culture, they're not going to do it unless they've at least got one of those bases for doing it. Okay, if they do it's a tick box exercise, everyone sees it. It happens a lot in business. And what happens is that the leaders go off on a nice retreat somewhere in the Swiss Alps, and the people that need the help are not getting the help, which are the middle managers, and they're not getting anything. So, I think it's changing. It's changing, but there's still to process for me in business about leadership.
There's one other thing on that.
Yeah.
Joe Schmidt didn't get a huge amount of credit for the environment at the end. It was a very stressful place to be. And that was fair enough. And I deal with that in the book. And I had a long interview with Joe. And we were talking about giving players bollockings. And he came up with an example. I was saying, look, offloading seemed to be completely off the menu with Ireland. And he had gone through Ian Henderson not Ian Henderson. He had gone through Stu McCluskey for a shortcut at a training session for offloading at the wrong time. And I put this to Joe, and his defense of it was to bring up an example from the All Blacks, where I think it was Rua Tupoki may have made an inopportune offload in an All Black game. And Steve Hampson was the coach at the time, and he replayed the video at the review on the Monday. And he said, okay, you see that offload that you made there? He said, we're now going to count the tackles that we had to make after that offload in order to clean up your mess. So Liam Mooney had to work overtime. Justin Fitzpatrick had to work overtime, Joe Bloggs. And he ran through the whole thing and he presented it to him and said, I don't have anything against offloads per se. I do have something against inopportune offloads, ones that causes trouble. And sorry, this is a long-winded way of making the point. When you're trying to engender teamwork, when you're trying to get to build your team spirit in a business environment, if you can get the message across that if Liam does his job really well, it's going to enable Justin to do his job really well, because there's going to be a crossover. And that's going to help everyone do their job well, and we're all going to be happy. And everybody we interact with, within and without our company, are going to go away with a positive impression. And that's good.
Absolutely.
Spot on. Let's talk about your new book, Touching Distance. It's about Irish rugby's battle with expectations, why expectations is such a powerful theme.
Expectations are good. If you're no use, nobody's any expectations. At least expectations of success are good. I spoke to Tony McGann a good bit in the chapter there's a chapter on each of the provinces. And the Leinster one leans heavily on Stuart Lancaster. The one on Munster deals extensively with Rassie Erasmus and how it was that he bailed out early on Munster, and he is on the record and upfront in explaining that. But at the start of the chapter, I speak a lot to Tony McGann, because Tony's timing was fortuitous in that I don't know if Munster would have won their second Heineken Cup if Tony hadn't been on board by that stage and heavily influencing their attack style. But that team began, and you're both familiar with this, the team started to break up, but the expectation levels among the Munster supporters did not go down anywhere. They'd won Magners League in 2011, they 2 Heineken Cups in 06 and 08. They thought that was going to continue. And managing that expectation was a real battle. And managing that expectation against a backdrop where insufficient time and energy and money has been put into developing the next generation is an accident waiting to happen. And that accident slowly unfolded over several years. And McGann was good, and he was on the record, and he was upfront talking about how improving the situation in Limerick schools in particular was something he had wanted to happen way back in 2009 and still wasn't happening when he signed off. And it still hasn't happened. David Humphreys, his old colleague, is now a year in the job as director of high performance, and very high on his agenda is trying to fix the paving stones in the pathway towards the Ireland team. Very strong in Leinster, pretty awful in the other three provinces. And that's taking up a lot of Humphreys' time. So expectation without groundwork is trouble.
Certainly, we touched upon this earlier in terms of fitness. It's not a quick fix. You've got to have that process and that layering of standards over time, and player identification and development is exactly the same. If you don't have that system in place, well, it's down to luck whether good quality players are span out of the academy system into the senior ones. So I mean, I'm glad to hear, and no better man than David Humphreys to set that up. Wish him every success.
It's an uphill battle for him financially, and not just financial resources, but human resources, because we're talking three provinces here. We're not just talking one. And he's going to need to find a lot of coaches. I deal with this. There's a chapter on David Nucifora, who was a huge influence here when he came in as the first director of high performance. And he had a long run at it. He did some good stuff. One of the things he didn't do particularly well was building our coaching cohort. He was focusing on other stuff. To find coaches are in short supply here. I'm not sure what the situation is in the UK, but over here, they're hard to come by.
Yeah. Well, it's a bit like the little boy in the dike, right? There's so many elements that need to get right for the now, for the medium term, for the long term, for success to be built, and those expectations, which are, rightly so, very high currently after all the success the national teams had, to be done. So, yeah, it's a process. I'm sure we'll get there.
Absolutely. Going into the book again, you dive into the leaders like Eddie O'Sullivan, Joe Schmidt, Andy Farrell. How, in your opinion, do their leadership styles differ? And what do you think perhaps business could learn from them?
It covers quite a long period of time, Liam, between Eddie signed off in 2008, largely because 2007 had gone so badly. Here we are in 2025, and Andy Farrell is still driving the bus. But Eddie was good and honest in looking back and saying, would I have done better if I had softer skills? He said, yeah, probably, but I didn't have those skills. And another point, he said back in 2000 and when he succeeded Warren Gatland, there wasn't much of a demand for soft skills. There was a demand for organising. There was a demand for logistics. There was a demand for X, Y, and Z. Nowhere on the list of the demands did somebody say, oh, by the way, we're big into culture. We're big into caring. We're big into soft skills. And that suited Eddie fine, as he said, because I didn't have them anyway. So it's a completely different environment. Joe was, for my money, the most transformational is a word Fitzy's used a couple of times in this chat. He was the most transformational figure in Irish rugby over the professional era, and he gave players huge comfort because of the breadth of his and the depth of his knowledge. So they went away saying, if Joe says it, it's right and it's going to happen. And they started doing the stuff that he did, and they started getting better, and it just built up this huge express train of confidence. His soft skills wouldn't have been brilliant. All coaches are control freaks to some degree. Joe really is controlling, to a point where at the end of the interview I had with him for this book, he was beginning to regret that he had been forthcoming, which is classic Joe. I would have spoken to him loads of times in his time here, between arriving in summer 2010 with Leinster through to Japan, post-Japan 2019. And any time we ever spoke, I always went away having learned quite a bit, but I only went away learning what he wanted me to learn. He was very good, quite manipulative, as coaches are of the media, the good coaches. But at the end of this interview, I think he felt that he had given too much. And he was very honest, as an example, that when he arrived into the hotel room in Tokyo in the Japan World Cup, he was at a really low ebb. His mother had died. Her illness had dominated the lead up to the tournament for him. He carried a bit of baggage of guilt over the fact that his dad died when he was with Auckland Blues and he was away on a Super Rugby weekend and he didn't get back in time for that. And he was beating himself up over that, thinking, oh, I could have, I should have. So he paid a lot of attention to his mom when she was struggling. And he got into the hotel room in Tokyo and he was mentally, emotionally, he was beaten up. And he said, I just didn't want to be there. So the conversation went on and we covered lots of other stuff and we dealt with the criticism he got post-tournament, and it was a really good conversation. Christ, no, I didn't. That sounds Trumpian. Sorry, I want to withdraw that. It was a good interview, and it was challenging. And at the end of it, then Joe kind of reaches out to try and start pulling stuff back and saying, "Oh, I didn't really." I said, "Joe, we're done. You know, you knew that the ground rules getting into this. It's good stuff, and I appreciate that, but it's going on the record." And then he said, yeah, okay, grand. But I didn't want to give so much of myself. And that wasn't in his nature because he had written a book. And with the best will in the world, it was a pretty ordinary read because Joe didn't give anything of himself in that book. It was all like coaching stuff and it was pretty dull. And he accepted that. So there you go.
And Andy Farrell?
Andy Farrell wouldn't talk to me. I spoke to over 100 people in writing this book, and I spent 3 months chasing Andy Farrell through intermediaries, and eventually at the end of the 3 months, I got some pretty lame line that, oh, it probably wouldn't be appropriate. He's still hitched to the IRFU and blah blah blah. And I'm thinking, okay, well, I said that at the outset and saved me some time, but it turned out he was writing his own book. So I'm sure the publisher probably told him, Andy, tell him whatever you want, just keep your gob shut until such time that it suits us to say we're writing our own book. So I don't know. I interviewed him once, Liam.
Yeah.
Not long after he came over, and I found him not bad. The setting for the interview was awful. It was a media day in a noisy setting, and it was just not conducive to getting something out of it. But when I reflected on it, I actually got way more than I realised. I can't claim to know Andy Farrell at all. I know what he's done and I've spoken to a lot of people around him and whatever. But I would have known Joe reasonably well over the years. I don't know Andy Farrell.
Yeah, that's the precursor for setting up a third book now.
So, I mean, obviously, you've dealt with a lot of Irish coaches over your career. Who were the most open, in your opinion, in dealing with the media, and who were the most closed? Just out of interest.
Eddie was good, yeah. I would honestly find it difficult to distinguish. They were radically different people. Declan Kidney was by a distance the most infuriating. Declan could just talk in riddles, and it suited his case to do that a lot of the time, and he doesn't, and I'll get this in the neck from Munster people now because there isn't a chapter on Kidney as such, and there's a fair amount of space and time given to Schmidt and to Lancaster and to Eddie and to Farrell, for the reason that certainly with Schmidt and Farrell and Lancaster, they had massive impacts on the way their teams played. They were almost revolutionary. Certainly Joe was. Certainly Lancaster was at Leinster. Declan didn't have that effect. Declan wasn't that type of coach. Moreover, Declan was working under a load that the others didn't have, certainly the ones who came after him, in that there was no director of high performance in place in the IRFU when Declan was there. Declan used to have to fight off the committee. Like the night, this sounds unbelievable, but it's true. The night before international matches, Declan would have to sit down with a selection of IRFU committee men who would question him about his match plan for the next day. Yeah, absolutely. Warren Gatland had to bear that load as well. It absolutely fried his brain. Declan had to struggle under it. When Nucifora came in, he said, yeah, look, that's mad. That's stopping straight away. So he was able to ride shotgun for Joe Schmidt. Declan had nobody riding shotgun for him, and he really could have done with it. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit off topic, but Declan was impenetrable. Trying to get info out of Declan was just... Now, I like him, and we get on better now than we did when I was trying to get info out of him. But yeah, he was, he was, I don't know how he did it in London Irish. We used to laugh thinking, if the Irish guys struggle with him, what are they going to make of him over in Sunbury? But he did very
True
well.
enough. Yeah, he did very well, and I think it's probably, and again, I don't know, but probably that can get strong working relationship and good connection between him and Les Kiss. It just
Yes.
works, you know.
Yeah.
I would think, because they had a great run. They did good things, and looked like they had it from the outside looking in, a great tight group there.
He had it as well with Les and Gert Small. That was good because Declan wasn't a on-field super techy coach, whereas the other two were picked up that slack. And Declan was good at the emotional side and caring for people, and genuinely Declan was a carer. You know,
100% agree, and he built great environments. That was very obvious.
Yes.
See, you spoke there about David DeFora, and you write about it in his influence on Irish rugby structures. How important have those systems and governments been to its success?
Massive. Well, the two things he did best of all, I suppose, one was the player traffic. I'm not saying he was the first guy to turn on the traffic lights, but he certainly got them on green more often. So lads were moving around the provinces when, rather than having a build-up of players stockpiling one position, and that certainly did an awful lot. He did a significant amount for developing a high-performance culture across the game and at the top end in the IRFU, and he did quite a bit for parking the committee into the committee zone and the high-performance end into the high-performance end, and giving the space and room to work to the national coach and supporting that national coach. Not so good on coaching, not so good on building relationships. In a system as small as ours, I think it makes sense to build as many relationships as you can. I think early doors he decided, okay, I don't need Liam Mooney, I don't need Justin Fitzpatrick, I'm going to bypass those guys, I'm going to go for Joe Bloggs and whoever. I need them, I'll talk to them. And he would pretty much ignore the pair of ye, which wasn't good for morale. But, you know, he wasn't perfect, but, you know, Jesus, did we need a director of high performance? Absolutely, we certainly did.
So one of the strongest parts of the book is how you describe the different identities of Munster, Leinster, Connacht and Ulster. What can companies learn from those provincial cultures?
No, it's not the strongest. This is you, Liam. You love this.
I don't, because you're going to ask me a question. I know you are.
I think it's a wee bit the kind of the grit of Ulster or the grit of Connacht, whatever. I think all of that stuff got diluted a little bit when we got into the pro era, and when the pressure came on to do your 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. And what Fitzy was talking about earlier on about the old days and not minding your P's and Q's and not working hard enough because, I mean, you know, you weren't answerable. I think those elements that you may be romantically involved with still, I don't think they hold as much sway now as they used to. I think business can learn loads from sport, from building of teamwork, but I don't think there is a wildly different culture at play across the four provinces. I could have that arseways, but that's just my feeling on it.
No, absolutely.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's that's an interesting take. I mean, it's been a hot minute since I've been involved, but in some ways I find that a little sad, because you know they do have their own distinct identities, and I don't think it's mutually exclusive to be professional and not tap into what it means to be an Ulsterman or a Connachtman or a Munsterman or a Leinsterman.
That comes from. Can I throw that back at you, Brendan? Because I obviously love talking about culture. So you could look at culture in a way that, perhaps that it's not, you know, divided up according to what province you are at the moment. But there's certain teams that always seem to produce more than what they're worth on paper. Now, like obviously you could look at Munster as one, and then if you look at the English League, you look at Exeter. And would you say that those sort of clubs do still have a different culture? I mean, I know Exeter have struggled in the last couple of years, probably mainly down to finances, but there are certain clubs that do seem to produce more than what they should.
I think it's a difference between identity and culture.
Yeah.
And identity is something you can tap into. Culture is what you live day to day. And absolutely, Fitzy would know this from Ravenhill. I don't know the phrase, but in the gym, there's that huge big quote up on the wall, which I think is taken from the First World War.
Yes, for the Battle of the Somme. Yeah, that was from an English officer who observed the Ulster soldiers going over the lip of the trench and butcher it, but not verbatim. It was something like witnessing these guys. I'd wish I could be an Ulsterman, or I'd rather be an Ulsterman than anything else. You know, but watching their bravery on that horrendous battlefront.
I love that because it does feed into their history. And we spoke about Dan McFarland, and when he was creating themes, he would create themes that were relevant to Ulster's history, which were really good. But at the other end of it, I have a personal experience of being in a changing room not that long ago, and one of the other coaches, all of a sudden I arrived in one day, and there were all these little messages up on the wall. Christ, where did these come from? And one was either stand where you fight or fight where you stand or something. Okay. And then there was something else. Then there was something else. I'm thinking, I didn't say this. I didn't ask. I mean, it was just, dial a
quote.
Dial a quote, John.
Yeah.
But again, by the same token, from Clubland, last year, and I'm coaching kids now, a skills coach with kids in Coolmine in West Dublin Junior Club, which I absolutely love. It is brilliant crack and very, very enjoyable. But I was chatting to one of the coaches after a game last year, and he was giving out about the Oppo and giving out, well, we all give out about everything, but he was bitching about the way they were behaving, the players and their coaches and yada, yada. And I said, okay, what do you think when they were going home? What do you think they said about us? And he says, what they said about us? And I said, why not? This is what I do. And he says, well, why? I said, well, I'm not suggesting that we should live our lives to ingratiate ourselves with other people, but I would like them to go away saying, those guys play really good rugby and they're pretty hard-arsed about it. They gave us absolutely nothing from start to finish. They didn't sledge us. They didn't celebrate our mistakes. They didn't behave like complete assholes. They treated us well before the game. They treated us well after the game. And you know what? They seemed to get on well together. They seemed to care for each other. There was a real strong sense of unity about them. I go away, they would have gone away with that positive impression of our club. We all live in a village. You're going to come across these people again in some shape or form. It could be Liam Mooney up on a disciplinary charge, and one of the guys that is sitting on the judging panel. It could be somebody going around asking for a recommendation of a club in your part of the world. And you say, yeah, actually, they're a good crowd. They know what they're at, and they seem like decent people. That comes, for my money, that comes from culture, from living it the right way and constantly checking yourself. Like, you can't agree it on the 1st of September at the start of the season and not revisit it, many times during the season. You have to keep checking yourself. Does what we're doing now fit in with what we agreed?
Absolutely.
Let's change tacks. Let's talk about World Cups. Over the last period of time, we've had great success as a nation in the Six Nations, a lot of dominance, but we've struggled when we've got to the World Cup. Why do you think Ireland has fallen short, and what is the business equivalent of those near misses?
I have a really good answer for you coming up. I have the solution. No, I don't.
You had us on bated breath there, Brendan.
Look, they were all different, and the disasters began. 03 wasn't. 99 was a disaster. 03 wasn't. 07 was. 11 wasn't. 15 wasn't. 19 kind of was. 23 had an awful ending. All of them are, over a long period of time, were different. And the reviews to each one helped make the next one slightly better. And then maybe something else would fall off the wagon, or something else would fall off the wagon. I don't know. I know in some cases they were undercooked in 07. In 2011 in New Zealand, when we lost to Wales in Wellington, if you remember, that really stands out, that game, as one where with a slightly better game plan, we would have put Wales away. And there isn't one thing that is common to all. All you can do is, and I don't believe in living in 4-year cycles, 2 years out from a World Cup, you need to start putting your World Cup goggles on and seeing how we're looking at X, Y, and Z positions. You just work your ass off to make sure that every moving part is well oiled and is going right. And then hope and pray that when you get there, you get a decent break on the injury front, on the illness front, on the refereeing front. You know, there's and critically, you need to have, as this sounds stupid, but it's true, you need to have as many worthy players as you can in your squad of 33. So you don't want 27 blokes you're happy to rely on, 6 guys who you're filling your pants if they have to rock up. You need as many as you possibly can who can say, yeah, okay, I'm going to have to put him in. He's going to be able to do a job. If you can get all that together, which is an awful lot to get together, then you might get to a last 4. Other countries have got to a last 4, which is beyond us. And they would swap. The likes of Wales, Argentina, we've achieved way more in rugby than Wales and Argentina outside of World Cups year to year than they have. We've been way more.
Great. So what's your? We're at the halfway point now. You mentioned sort of 2 years out from the World Cup. What's your litmus test as to how we are at the moment and what the future looks like in 2 years' time in Australia?
We're going to have a pretty old team. Probably of the starting 15, I would say 7 or 8 of them are going to be over 30. And in some positions, there's a yawning gap. It's not tight head, thankfully. That has been shored up a bit. But think how Gibson Park is going to be replaced. We'll go okay. We'll struggle in November, I say, post Lions. We'll probably recover okay in the Six Nations. We badly need a couple, 2, 3, 4 players to come through to become squad players, maybe. But there's going to be a wholesale clear out after the next World Cup. And I don't think there's going to be that big of a clear out beforehand because there just aren't enough like for likes. So that's why it was such a downer not to get through that end game against the Kiwis in France, 23. It really was a golden apple. Sorry, it's not very optimistic, is it?
Well, and it's funny you touch upon guys getting over 30, and I think what I think the provincial system has done and the national system has done very, very well is manage minutes. And I don't think being over 30 is that big a deal for our players as it is for some of the other nations. There's not as many miles on the clock, and players are managed a lot better. So yes, is it a concern as guys get older that they're potentially a little bit more injury prone and so on and so forth? But I think that's less of a concern for us than it is for other.
That's a good point. And you can be damn sure that the minute management over the next 2 years is going to be intensive.
For sure. Okay, so you've been covering rugby for about 30 years. What common traits do you see in elite athletes that separate them from the rest?
Selfishness.
Okay, expand upon that.
The ability to keep your eyes on the prize, no matter what's going on around you and your family or your friends. One of the mistakes Leinster made post the Saints' defeat in the Heineken in the Vestec Cup, European Cup last season, was Leo Cullen gave there was a little video from Leinster's team base a couple of days later. The pure idea, I guess, being, look, we need to calm the natives and say, yeah, we're hurting, we're all hurting. It's another defeat by Leinster at when we wanted and expected them to win. And the word sacrifice was used 4 or 5 times during the course of the interview. And I'm thinking, hang on a second. If you're a carer and you're working 2 jobs, or any number of walks of life where you need to make sacrifices in order to create a better environment for your family or your whoever, professional sport is I wouldn't relate professional sport to sacrifice. If you have to miss a bar mitzvah or a communion or a wedding, you catch up, because your career is going to be over when no matter how well the minutes are managed, for most of them, it's going to be over in their mid-30s. You can spend the rest of your life catching up. But during that period, the really good professional players keep their eyes on the prize and say, sorry, I can't go to that wedding or I can't go to that thing. I've got to prepare for this game and get myself in the best nick possible. And that contributes to them being as good as they are. Obviously, they have talent, and talent is, by definition, natural. And if they have their eyes on the prize, which they have, then they develop the talent and they embellish it. But it's about being able to see, okay, I'm going to push that to one side. I'm going to focus on what I have to do, and I'm going to do it.
Very good. You use the word selfish. I would say obsessional, right?
Yeah.
They're just eyes on that prize, and you can see the great ones. You know, thinking back to Brian O'Driscoll, he was someone I was described as obsessional. Every little bit of detail built on great talent. So, what about coaches? What makes the great ones stand out for you as leaders?
The combo between knowledge. You can't beat knowledge, and constantly adding to their knowledge bank, and critically getting that message across to a group of people when we all learn different ways. Some people need to see something written down. Some people need to see it enacted in front of their eyes. Some people can only deal with info orally or hourly rather. So it's finding a way that you can get everybody to plug into the system, which is not easy.
No.
And then there's the dealing with the temperament to deal with all the people like me, media, who are badgering them and being a pain in the ass, and fans and all of that. Like it's a pretty tricky number. So if you have all those skills, then you're going to be very good.
So let's talk now about lessons that you can learn from sport. One of the articles we published a few weeks ago was about the biggest lesson that business can learn from sports, about overcoming adversity. And in your own career, you've highlighted that you faced some adversity. You talk about redundancy. We could also talk about deadlines, criticism, big stories. But what messages or what have you learned from sport to help you overcome those adverse situations?
Well, I haven't had a whole lot of adversity, a few awkward things in the line of business when you're printed a story that you know is going to cause issues, and a few sweaty moments. But if you do get it right beforehand, then, and you know you're on solid ground, then you're on solid ground. And yeah, you get a bit of blowback, but you know, what of it? That's you knew the nature of the business when you get into it. So, and it is largely the toy department. Sometimes it's not the toy department, but most people look on sports journalism as being in the toy department. And so, you know, we're lucky for that. Outside of it, yeah, rugby is good in resilience. I'm not sure if it's better than other sports, but I think there is a link, Liam, between the physical nature of rugby and the development of resilience, because it's one thing me supporting you on the field in football, or maybe in basketball, or maybe in a low contact sport, where I can support you without taking on physical risk myself. It's a completely different issue where I take on significant physical risk in order to support you. And to be able to do that when you're under pressure, I think that without question, to be able to do that under pressure, I think that builds resilience. So when the wind is blowing full on into your face and you think, yeah, okay, I've been here before, I've done that for him, I know I can cope with this.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that.
That's a great point there, Brendan. We have to tap into courage to lesser or greater degree, to put ourselves in harm's way for our teammates again and again and again. We do sick, tired, or sore. So that's a really, really, really interesting point. We've spoken about and we gave a sort of a halfway point review of where the Irish team is ahead of the 27 World Cup, but where, in your opinion, is Irish rugby as a whole, the provincial sides, the age group, the women's teams, where do they stand today, in your opinion? Are they stronger than ever, or are there some vulnerabilities there?
But there's a huge vulnerability. We discussed it earlier on over the development pathways, certainly in 3 of the 4 provinces. And it's almost by chance that the 4th province, Leinster, is as strong as it is on the development front, because I refer to the Accidental Academy, which is the school system in Leinster, specifically the Leinster School Senior Cup. And there is a cohort of schools who have very strong rugby programmes. Primarily, they're aimed at getting to St. Patrick's Day in the Schools Cup final and winning medals. But the byproduct is obviously not everybody can win. So lots of those kids who are not winning are still coming through a system that steals them and prepares them very well. And Leinster are the beneficiary. So all of these kids are coming through this system and are keen to go and play for Leinster. None of the other provinces have that. So the challenge is not to copy and paste what Leinster are doing in the other three provinces. And I deal with this extensively in the final chapter on Ireland, which covers Andy Farrell and covers David Humphreys. But to come up with a system in each of those other three provinces that is an improvement on a significant improvement on what it is now. They can still continue to take Leinster's cast-offs, but they have to make a humongously better effort at producing their own. And if you're not producing your own, you're in trouble.
Absolutely. And obviously, we're coming towards the end of the show. We've spoken to you for a long time, and we kept a lot of your time. We're very grateful for that.
Moons, it's no problem.
Oh, great stuff. We know it's a special day for you.
If you're not billing, you're not winning. Is that what you fellas say?
Something like that.
I do culture, Brendan, not slogans. You should know that by now. Okay. So what's next for Brendan Fanning? More books or a different type of storytelling?
I'm not sure. Books are a good model. They're tax-free in this country. I quite like the rhythm of writing a book. I'd like if there was a bit more time to it. Oh, I'd be disenchanted now with all the press. As a run-of-the-mill journo running around to press conferences and all of that stuff, that's a drudge. I don't miss that. I still tip away. I'm doing stuff for the match reporting for the Sunday Times and for the Guardian and for Rugby Pass. I tip away at that. And I'll write anything. I won't write anything, but like I don't see myself having the confidence or the ability to go and write a novel. But yeah, I might do another ghost. I loved doing Willie Anderson's autobiography. I loved ghostwriting that because he was just so brilliant to work with. And I'd happily work with somebody inside of rugby or outside of rugby. Stories are stories, Liam.
Yeah.
Whether they're in sport or I end up writing sports stories because that's a passion of mine. But I'm sure there are any number of people out beyond that who have brilliant stories that are worth telling.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we'll see.
Very good. Well, we're into the fun segment of the podcast.
Fitzy, it's all been fun.
Wow, the real fun. There's levels to fun. So we're into our quick fire round questions. Okay, short and sharp. Let's go. One trait you've seen in every elite player you've covered.
Okay, I've covered that. Selfishness, right, for the want of a kinder word.
Obsession.
Yeah, obsession. Okay.
The single best coach or leader you've observed and why?
Joe Schmidt. He inspired confidence. He was a hard ass, but his breadth of knowledge and understanding was second to none.
One lesson business can steal straight from rugby.
Teamwork, genuine teamwork, that you're trying to help the guy beside you, because if you do, it's good for everybody.
Your proudest moment in journalism.
Jesus. I did a piece with John Fogarty, who you'd know, the Ireland scrum coach, when he had to give up playing because of concussion. And it involved going out to his gaff, and which is a bit unusual. Most interviews nowadays are on neutral territory. And he gave me the whole story of the lead up to it and the decision and the pain of doing it, and et cetera, and he was fantastic. He was really forthcoming and really giveish. And there was a brilliant photograph that went with the piece of him playing with his daughter out in the park, and the whole package worked really well, and it got a lot of traction at the time, and I was very glad that I got it and I did it.
If you could fix one thing in Irish rugby tomorrow, what would it be?
Urgency. Part of the downside of our success, and we have had humongous success over the years relative to other nations with similar resources. The downside, I think, is that we fall in love with ourselves a bit, and we don't shake every tree and dig up every hole and look in every corner to try and find more X-factor players who did not come up through the private school system populated mostly by skinny white guys. We need to go and we have a multicultural society. we need to broaden our base, and we need to be urgent about it, not just say, oh yeah, that'll be good, let's do that. Get out there and do it.
Brendan, it's been fantastic having you here with us. From there to here, told the story of Irish rugby's leap into professionalism. Touching Distance shines a light on the weight of expectation and the leadership behind success and failure. Together, they capture not just rugby's journey, but the universal lessons in resilience, culture, and leadership. Thank you for joining us today on The Business End. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Pleasure's mine, lads. Thanks very much indeed. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you, Brendan. We brought a ray of sunshine to you as well. When you started the show, it's pouring down with rain, and you look almost angelic there at times with the sun coming through.
Next time we get a bad weather forecast, we are going to give you a shout.
Thanks, Brendan.
Thank you, Brendan.